Pulled off balance by his tugging, she tried to free her hand. He wouldn't let go. "They mustn't catch you! They mustn't catch you!" he kept repeating. "I'd be alone! They mustn't catch you!" Behind them came the wild thing, as it ran and made a cry, an sound burping up out of its throat, high-pitched and urgent. The noise carried in the stillness, and other voices answered. "Three more coming!" Amy had looked back. "Run! They mustn't catch you! Us! Catch us!" No, he couldn't admit that terror. "Not me. I'm not from the city." She had no time to understand and did not try. She only knew she could not run far, having to compensate for each off-balance step, and if she did not free herself from his protective grip, she would fall, and they would both be lost. With effort, she forced herself to run fast enough to create a slack in his tugging, and then jerked free. He sought her hand again, and she struck out at him. "Alone," she panted. "Run faster alone." He looked hurt, but let her go. Even in panic, he led them west, toward home, where safety lay. Through the slits in the rags she wore, Amy saw the ground as a blur, where every now and then something sparkled and was gone. Her sides hurt, and her chest, and each yelp of sound behind her struck her stomach like a physical blow. She could hear the pursuers were getting closer. How close she could not tell, and turning to look back would mean slowing down. The thought occurred to her that the crazies could catch them, and weren't. As if they wanted to run them to death, or were playing some vicious game. The sort of game crazy adults played on children in the city when there were no guards around. Something yelled ahead of them. She looked up, squinted to see, and nearly stopped, despairing. It yelled again. Running toward her was a brown figure that, in her blurred view, had thick wads of hair tangled over one arm, and in the other hand carried something shiny. The crazies behind stopped yelping as if to listen to this new member of the pack. Just then the newcomer slowed and threw what looked like a brown and white bag whirling through the air over Amy's head. She heard it thud onto the ground, heard a yelp of surprise, and then a growl. The closest footpad stopped. The more distant slowed. "Amy!" the newcomer called, and Amy's hope returned. "James!" Excitement and relief nearly choked the words in Axel's throat. Another brown and white thing was thrown at the crazies. "Keep running!" yelled James, and he stopped. As she passed him, Amy saw that he held a dead rabbit in one hand, and Elton's gun tight in the other. The drawstrings of his bag were tied around his waist. She had gotten perhaps 10 yards beyond him when her wind gave out and she staggered to a halt. Axel ran on some distance before he realized he'd lost her, and circled back to where she stood. She turned to look at James. Adjusting her eye rag, which had slipped as she ran, she saw him holding the crazies at bay. 2 of them at least. 3 more were fighting over the rabbits, pushing and hitting, tugging on the bodies. The 2 wild men facing James looked at each other, then, as if in an effort to distract him, separated and began to approach from either side. "I will kill!" James aimed directly at the largest one, and both stopped. The large one pulled its hair back to stare at him in what appeared to be a threatening manner, a ritual display of dominance. It was a male. There was a large red welt on its abdomen and sores on its chest and legs. "Disgusting!" Axel whispered his contempt. But for Amy, fear and revulsion mingled with pity for the creature. Those sores must hurt. If she lived out here alone, for as long as it took hair to grow that long. She took a deep breath and wiped sweat from her neck and chin. "I'll kill!" James warned again. "Go back!" At that, one of the trio fighting over the meat glanced at James. His 2 companions took advantage of his distraction and snatched the rabbit from its grasp. Fur tore and red flashed in the sun. The wild man whirled, picked up a rock, and struck the nearest hairy head a clunk. The victim dropped and lay quite still. The other shrieked and ran, taking all 3 rabbits. The attacker followed in pursuit. "Go!" James told the 2 remaining crazies, but they did not move. The one still covered by its hair scratched vigorously about its waist. then bent down as if to pick up a stone to throw. James aimed and fired. A strip of grass went up in smoke. The wild one froze, hands outstretched. James slowly backed away. "I don't think they understand words," Axel said when James got close enough to hear. "Do you? I said run." "We can't. We're out of breath." "Want them to kill you? Run." "But you've stopped them," Axel protested. "For now. There are more, all over." "I never saw them where I live." "You don't live here." "Maybe we better do what James says." Amy was still panting, but the pain had eased in her side and her adrenaline level was up. She felt able to go on. When he heard her speak his name, her recognition of him as a person, James smiled as if he'd just received a gift. He let the gun falter. The kneeling wild man rose and took a step. James quickly aimed, and the other paused, ready to spring. "Could you shoot them? Just a little, so they can't chase us?" Amy suggested. James shook his head. "That's cruel. Kinder to kill than wound. Infection makes slow dying here." "They'd kill us," said Axel. "Look at them." "Poor animals," said James, and something in his tone made Amy like him. He sounded the way she felt when she wondered if she could live out here alone. And it occurred to her, in that glimpse of growing up, that it must have been hard to live the way James did. Friendless, exposed to stares and contempt and rats. And he had been born above and sent down, and that was worse. No wonder he seemed crazy. Axel was afraid he would grow up to live like that. For James, it had come true. "Ah!" The piercing scream was intended to startle, to frighten, and it did. And with that cry both wild men came for them in a rush. Perhaps, as wild things will, they sensed James's empathy, his reluctance to kill, and mistook that empathy for weakness. Distracted by her own thoughts, Amy was so frightened by the scream that her heart skipped a beat, and for that instant time seemed to stop. She saw the three of them, James and the two wild men, in slow ballet. James hesitating, aiming first at one, then the other, not wanting to kill. She was aware of hairy legs with bald knees flashing out of hair skirts, filthy hands with taloned fingers, lips drawn back ape-like to bare teeth as the shrieks crescendoed. The hands were reaching out to tear and grab. She saw the blue laser flash repeatedly. One body leaped aside, writhing, hands clutching at its middle as if to tear out pain. It fell to the ground convulsing, and went still. It was the lucky one. The other tried to dodge the beams, and the lethal light pierced its hair. The hair, filthy with years of body oil and animal fat, ignited and blazed up. The creature twisted, ran, and fell. The final screams were human. James fired again, 3 times, as if to correct a terrible mistake, and then, very like his victims, cried out and sank down on his knees, convulsed by sobs. The gun fell from his hand and clanked against a stone. Amy had never seen a man cry before, never seen anyone cry like this, and if she had not been so deep in shock it would have frightened her. James cried as if his heart would break, as if everything he'd ever suffered never had been given voice. Beside her, Axel turned away to be sick on the grass. She stood, dumb, looking from one to the other, and then decided James needed help more. There wasn't much that she could do except put her hand on his shoulder. He was shaking, and his skin felt cold through his shirt, although he was drenched with sweat. When he became aware of her, he tried to talk. The words were interrupted by his sob reflex, and when she finally understood them, they had no meaning for her then. "They brought me down to their level," he sobbed. "They brought me down. They brought me down." She knew he didn't refer to the dead men, but then to whom? The wind blew and brought the smoke and scent of what had burned swirling their way. Amy sniffed and wiped her nose and looked around to find Axel. He was sitting on the ground, looking pale and exhausted. his eyes great circles in his little face. Perhaps a quarter of a mile away 3 wild men stood in a row on a knoll, watching. "We have to go, James," she decided. "We can't stay here. You have to get up now." She patted the sweat-soaked shoulder of his shirt. "We're going home to Axel's place. You have to help us get there. You can't sit here and cry. We've come too far for that." He raised his head and looked up at her. Weeping had washed some of the madness from his soul. Mind and muscles had relaxed, and its brief smile, when it came, was beautiful. As he looked at her, his eyes filled again. He swallowed audibly, and his Adam's apple jerked. He nodded in affirmation and pushed himself to his feet. She picked up the gun and held it out to him. He shook his head. "Yes," she said, "we'll need it." He shook his head again. Amy hesitated, then, making sure it was turned off, stuck the gun in her pocket. "Come on," she said, and took his hand. "Let's go." He nodded again, and then reached down and helped Axel to his feet. "Come on," James said. "We're going home."